Hello and welcome to this FarmIQ webinar, the third of the Ask Libby coaching series. I'm Jackie Bedford and I'll be on the control panel for this session. Shortly I'll hand over to your presenter, Libby Woods, but first I'll run through a bit of housekeeping and a quick poll. So for those joining us for the first time, you've got a control panel in front of you and you can use that orange arrow to reduce and enlarge it to get it out of the way so you can see what's going on the screen. Now currently all attendees are muted to minimise noise, but there are two ways you can participate. Firstly, we may ask you to raise your hand and you can do that by clicking on that raise hand icon. So let's do a sound check. If you can hear me, please raise that raise hand icon right now. Yep, thanks Mario. Now, you can ask a question at any time, and please do. We'd like this to be interactive and for you to, get some answers to your questions. So, and also Libby will answer them as she goes. At the end, we could take some questions verbally and she'll tell you how to do that then. Now, at this point, I'm just going to do a quick poll to find out a bit more about you. So a poll should have appeared on your screen. And if you could just select the option that applies. So just click. Right, okay. So we've got a few owner operators and most people are sitting in the 1 to 5 permanent or part-time staff. But of course, we'll be also considering visitors and contractors. And of course, there's the families that live on the farm as well. So that's good, thank you. So just before I hand over, I'm just going to say a disclaimer at this point. FarmIQ doesn't actually provide advisory services around health and safety. What we've focused on doing is developing tools for recording and reporting based on WorkSafe guidelines. So Libby will talk you through some of how it works this evening, but it's up to the employer to make sure that you understand what's legally required of you. So let's get started and I'll hand over to our presenter in Tauranga, Libby Woods. Hi, Libby.
Hi, Jackie. Thanks for the introduction there. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. So, welcome to our health and safety webinar. For those of you joining us for the first time, I am Libby Woods. I'm the National Dairy Business Manager for FarmIQ. Today we're going to be talking about health and safety, what we need to do and why we need to do it. So on our agenda today, we have the following. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the Act, so our legal requirements, and we're going to have a look at some of the definitions in the Act just to clear those up. Then we're going to talk briefly about how to get started making a plan on your farm. Thirdly, we'll have a look at the health and safety tools in FarmIQ and how using these tools can help you be compliant with the law. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So as Jackie said, please feel free to type any questions as we go, and I will pause and answer some of those where possible. Right, so before we get into some details, let's have a think about why we need to be focused on health and safety aside from our legal requirements. So yes, it certainly is a compliance activity, but it's a lot more important than that. It's about ensuring that everyone that goes to work goes home at the end of the day safe and healthily. Back to your friends, back to your family. There's not much more important than that. So we've got an obligation to look after ourselves and look after each other. And it's really just about being, caring about each other and looking out for each other. If the emotive side isn't quite enough for you, it also makes really good economic sense. If you've got staff off work with injuries or illnesses that are completely avoidable, it's costly to the business. So, you know, it's a really good thing to foster a farm culture of looking after each other and thinking about the implications and the risks of doing things before you act. So moving on, what are our legal requirements? So the main piece of legislation that we need to know about, and it's important that everyone knows about this, regardless if they're an employer or an employee, is the Act is the Health and Safety at Work Act 2015. So there's some key points in here that I'm going to cover off. So the Act ensures that everyone has a role to play. So that is whether you're an employer or an employee. Both parties have roles to play. They have duties to ensure that everyone is healthy and safe on farm. So the Act makes everyone's responsibilities clear, e.g. if you are an owner or a worker. It focuses on managing work risk. It requires those who create the risk to manage the risk. It requires businesses to engage with their staff so that everyone is actively participating in health and safety in the business or on the farm in this case. And it allows some flexibility in managing health and safety risks. So the main point around the flexibility is this thing that we're going to talk about, which is reasonably practicable, and we'll come to that in a moment. So these are the basics of the Act. I would encourage you, if you're not very familiar with it, to have a look at the WorkSafe website, which has got all the details on there. And there's some really great resources just to help you start to think about pulling that plan together on farm. So, reasonably practicable. We've got a little picture here of a guy being wrapped up in bubble wrap, and I'll get to that in a moment. So, reasonably practicable. Essentially, it means what is reasonably able to be done to ensure health and safety? What can be done, and is it reasonable in the circumstances? So when we're talking about reasonably practicable, we've got a few criteria to consider. So what is the likelihood of the risk or the hazard occurring? What's the degree of harm that could result from this hazard or risk? What does the person concerned know or ought to reasonably know about this hazard or risk, and ways that they can minimize or eliminate it? What's the availability and the suitability of ways to minimize or eliminate these risks? And after assessing these risks and the available ways to minimize or eliminate them, what's the cost associated with these ways? And is the cost grossly disproportionate to the risk? So my man in bubble wrap there is just a little bit of an example here. So if we were thinking about staff riding two-wheeler motorbikes on the farm, it is reasonable and it is practical that that staff member wears a helmet when they drive this two-wheeler motorbike. Pretty sensible. It is not necessarily reasonable or practical that we wrap a staff member up in bubble wrap every time they've got to go and ride the bike. So it's what's suitable for that situation, and it's really important to look at those criteria when you're thinking about these things, because if you haven't done what is reasonably practicable in a situation and somebody gets hurt, that's when you're going to be liable, because you've not done what is reasonable and what is practical to do in that situation. So that's just a little bit about reasonably practicable. So moving on now, we're going to talk a little bit about health and safety roles on the farm. So as I said, part of the Act means that everyone in the business has a role to play to ensure that health and safety is happening on farm, and it's part of the culture and part of the day-to-day workings. All of these roles have got duties to be compliant with, and you have to be compliant with the law or you're going to face consequences. So just a little bit of those around those consequences. You know, the sort of minimum level of consequence or punishment for going to court for failing to be compliant is a fine. Worst case scenario, you know, if a director fails to meet their requirements, they can actually go to jail for up to 3 years. So some pretty serious consequences here. So whether we like it or not, we really have to make sure that we are up to spec with meeting the requirements of the Act. So we've got these 3 roles here. We've got PCBU, we've got workers and officers. So I'm just going to briefly describe a little bit about what these mean. So a PCBU stands for person conducting a business or undertaking. So the person is singular there, but it can actually be more than one person. Most New Zealand businesses fit under this PCBU term. So a business is described as usually conducted with a view to making a profit. So a farm fits into that description perfectly. And then undertaking is essentially a project. It's something that happens within that business, but doesn't necessarily make a profit. So that's sort of a basic definition of that term. Moving on, workers. So we've talked about PCBU. So that's essentially the company, the organisation, the top level, and then within that we've got our workers. So essentially it's employees. So whether they're a full or a part-time employee, whether they're a contractor or a subcontractor, or an employee of the above. It also includes apprentices, trainees. If you've got a Lincoln or a Massey student on farm doing some work experience, they're all included in this workers definition. So a worker has responsibilities as well. They've got to make sure they're meeting health and safety policies on farm. They've got to behave reasonably to ensure health and safety for themselves and for others. Our next definition is officers. So an officer is typically going to be the business owner in a farm situation. It's someone that's got significant influence over the management of the business. So there could be more than one. If your farm is set up as a partnership, both of those partners could be an officer. And they are responsible to ensure that due diligence is being undertaken to make sure that the business is meeting its obligations, and they really need to have a good understanding of the Act and what the requirements are. So I've just got a couple more definitions before we get into the juicy stuff. So often there's a little bit of confusion around what is a hazard and what is a risk. And they're actually 2 quite separate things, but there's definitely a link there. So a hazard is a source of harm. It's something that can cause harm to somebody. As well as it being a thing, we've got our tractor here as an example. It can also include a person's behaviour. So if they're behaving in a way that has potential to cause somebody else injury, illness, or worst case scenario, death. So that is a hazard. So vehicles are a great example of a hazard on farm. Vehicles cause about 80% of deaths on farm. So they're really a significant hazard for us to be considering. Moving on to a risk. So a risk is something that arises from people being exposed to a hazard, so being exposed to a source of harm. So thinking back to our vehicle hazard, a risk associated with tractors, is having an accident, maybe having a crash or sliding down a bank, for example. So an incident in that vehicle, and a risk to others is being around tractors, being run over, for example, if you're behind someone and they don't see you. So a distinct difference there between a hazard and a risk. It's really important to know the difference between the 2. So now we know some basics about the Act. What does this actually mean to us on farm? How do we apply this to our business? And as a PCBU or an officer, it's your responsibility to ensure that this is applied to our business so that we can be compliant. There's a really great figure that I've just put up here that's come from the WorkSafe website. And it's a great process to follow, whether you're just starting to create a plan for the farm, or if you've already got one and you just want to make sure that you're up to speed and keep checking in on it. So it's a little process diagram we've got here. The first stage is number one, is plan. So this is where you go out and you identify your hazards and you assess the risks. So it's really important to do this for your property. Everyone's going to have slightly different risks that they come across. It's going to be unique to your farm, to your staff, to your equipment, to whatever you're dealing with. There's no point just pulling a plan off the shelf and expecting it to do the job. So we go through, we identify what we're dealing with, and we assess what risks we're managing on a day-to-day basis. Step two is do. So here we want to be eliminating or minimizing our risks. So first option always is, can we eliminate this risk? Obviously, there's going to be lots of things on farm that are risks that we cannot eliminate. So, we've got to have an effluent pond. We can't eliminate that as a hazard. We've got to isolate it. We can put a fence around it, and we can minimize the risk of someone having an incident around that particular hazard. So step three is check. So monitoring our control measures. So whatever controls we put in to deal with each hazard and risk, we need to be monitoring to make sure that these control measures are actually doing what we intend them to do. Are they suitable? Are they working? If we're still having incidences, if we're still having accidents around particular hazards, then certainly we need to reassess our control measures. And then number four, act. So reviewing for continuous improvement. So this is when we have our maybe monthly team meetings, or we have a weekly toolbox meeting. It's assessing how we're doing. It's making sure that everyone's on the same page and checking that the system's working. So we can work through that flow diagram at any point. That might be something you do monthly. It might be something you do weekly. It might be something you do when you get a health and safety consultant to come in every so often and just make sure your system is up to scratch. So before I move on, I see we've just had a question here. Is it more important to manage hazards or risks? So both are very important, but risk is really the thing that you need to be focusing on. So managing those risks. So often the hazard is something that you cannot eliminate, but it's how you manage that's what's going to be important. So thank you for that question. We will move on now. So today we're going to look at some digital recording tools which can help us to be compliant on farm. There's several systems out there. There's some paper-based, there's some digital systems, but to my mind there's some really clear benefits to using a digital system. So first off, you've got all of your information in one place. It's easy for any staff to access if they need to find information. If they need to find a hazard sheet for a particular chemical, or an emergency plan, they can just jump in and really easily find all that information at the click of a mouse. So it's also really easy to extract information. So if you need to pull that info out for an audit, or if you want to share it with somebody, it's really easy to do. In digital systems, there's obviously there's often very simple recording and reporting that's there. It's ready to use. And another really clear advantage to my mind is that it helps it make it more of a living process. It's all well and good doing a plan on paper, but so often they just get put in the filing cabinet, and that they're done for compliance reason, but they're not really integrated into the day-to-day life of the farm, which is what we really need them to do. We need to grow this health and safety culture. We need to get staff to be looking out for each other. So having it as that digital tool, it's a living document. It's really easy to update and make changes to as you go. So really fosters that continuous improvement. So let's have a look at some digital tools, see what we've got here in the FarmIQ system to help us meet our compliance requirements. So just bear with me for 2 seconds and I will open up the FarmIQ system. There we go. So this is our FarmIQ dairy demonstration farm. So it's a fictitious farm, but it's got lots of real data in it that we can have a look at and have a bit of a play with. So first things first, let's have a look at some of our hazard mapping. So we can see I've got a few things already on my map here. I've got my effluent pond drawn in, I've got a pump, I've got some overhead cables here, and I can see this in my legend down the bottom corner here, which is giving me a running total of how long, what length of cables I've got and how many pumps and things like that. So what we're going to do first is we're going to have a look at drawing in a new hazard. So there's lots of benefits to having all these hazards mapped. Obviously, first one is communication. It makes it easy for staff to see. It makes it easy for contractors or visitors to see. I should just point out that we do have a mobile app with this, and you can see the hazard map on the phone. The benefit of looking at it on the smartphone app is that we've actually got a GPS locator on there. So you can hit that and you can see where you are on farm in relation to all the hazards around you. So what we're going to do today is we're going to draw in a new hazard. And we're going to say, for the sake of argument, that I have put in a second effluent pond. So I'm going to add another hazard into my effluent pond hazard type, and I'm going to draw a new hazard in here. So I'll give it a name. We'll call it pond 2, and I'm drawing it in today. So what's my potential harm? Well, obviously if somebody falls in, they could potentially drown. So that's a potential harm category, fatality. Helps if I can spell. Cool. And we've also got risk of bacterial infection as well if somebody got bacteria. I can't spell today, apologies. Bacteria. There we go. So we've got some potential harm in there. So for my controls, as I mentioned before, if possible, we want to eliminate the risks around this hazard, but it's not something we can do. We have to have an effluent pond. So all we can do is we can minimize this hazard. So now I've set up my basic information, I'm going to go and draw in my second pond. Cool. All done. So anything I draw on this hazard map is actually going to automatically go into my hazard register. And a hazard register is something that I need to be maintaining as part of our compliance requirements. So I've sort of hit two birds with one stone there. So I finished drawing my hazard, and there we go. There's my new hazard on the map there. So let's go now and have a look at that in our hazard register. So at the top here in my left-hand menu, I've got all of my data entry menus, and I'm going to look under health and safety. So we've got 5 sections that we're going to have a look at today. We've got visits, we've got incidents and safety interactions, hazards and risks, emergency procedures, and team meetings. So first up, let's go and look at our hazard register. Great. So here we can see I've got a register of all of my hazards that I've got on farm, and I've got some pictures in here for a few of those. And I'm going to navigate using my menu on the left here to find my effluent pond that we've just looked at. Great, so there's pond 2 that I just drew, and let's have a look at pond 1 that I already had in here. So I've got a picture of my pond, I've got the date that I identified in it and that potential harm, which we put in at the time. So creating a hazard from this point, as you can see in the top right-hand corner, I can actually add a hazard here without having to map it. But editing from here, I can put much more information in. So I could put some notes around maybe when the pond was put in, or when we did some fencing there, for example, I've got attachments. So here's my picture. I can change that. I can update that as time goes by. And I've got some controls that I've put in here as well. So this is really about managing that risk that this hazard creates. So my pond is the hazard, and my risk is the risk around falling in, for example. So all I can do is minimize it. I can isolate it. I can put a fence around that pond. I can put some signs up to make sure people are aware that it's in that paddock, for example. I could go on, but that's what I've got so far. So I can also map my pond. So this is linking back to our map that we had at the beginning there. So if I were to export this hazard, for example, it would have all of that information, including my map, contained in it. So I've actually created an action in here already down the bottom. I can add in as many actions as I want, but I've created an action here earlier today. So I've got a new farm manager coming. So they're going to be arriving in the next few months. And our new farm manager is bringing their family with them. So we're going to have kids on farm for the first time. So that's an extra consideration around health and safety. So I decided to put an action in here to upgrade my fencing. You know, there's a fence around the pond, but it's not great, and it certainly wouldn't be child-proof. So I've created an action in here that I'm going to actually go out and do some work on that fence to be finished by this time next week. And I've assigned it to certain staff. So all of these staff are going to have a notification in our FarmIQ task management system. So we can see here that I've got a task, and this is where I have created my dates. You know, it's my little to-do list to show that, yep, that's the action I'm going to do, and it's associated to this hazard. So once we've completed our fencing and we've marked that as done, I've then got a record against that hazard to show that I identified that there was an issue, we took an action, and we resolved the issue. So I'll just go back into my hazard register again. Cool, so we just looked at our effluent pond, which was something that was on the map. So let's have a look at a hazard that we actually can't map. So let's have a look at our tractor, for example. So, so this is a hazard that's in our register that we can't physically draw on a map. There wouldn't be any point because obviously it moves around. So again, I can put information in, I can put a photograph in, I identify what it is, when I identified it, and what potential harm there is. So if we just go in and edit this, and we can see how easy it is to put some of this information in. So I've got some potential harm in here, some text in here, and I can actually choose presets for that. So I just chose from some of the presets in here. So you know, we've got pain or discomfort for a person, for example. I could add that one in there. So I've got it twice now. Cool. So really easy to populate. It's going to prompt you to help you build this hazard type. So from here, we've got our section around controls. So can we eliminate it? No. Okay, but we can minimize the risk. And we've got some suggestions in here and some examples just to help you create that. So I've chosen some admin in here. So for my staff driving the tractors, I'm going to make sure that they're trained. I'm going to make sure that staff that are able to drive these tractors are the only people that do drive these tractors. And I'm going to look at some PPE as well. I don't know about you, but I've driven some old tractors where you most certainly want ear defenders on for the noise. So that's what I've put in there. And we've got some actions down here as well. So just some basic common sense things like, you know, keeping it clean and tidy so that there's no hazards in the cab, keeping it well greased, and putting the bonnet up after use, particularly in springtime when those birds are nesting. So that's how I can create a hazard. And as I say, there's lots of prompts to help me and lots of information to help me make sure that I'm putting everything that I need to in there. So I will save that. Great, so we've looked at hazards that we can map, and we've looked at hazards that are not on the map, and we've had a quick look at how we can create those. So there's my tractor. So in a nutshell, that is hazards and hazard recording, hazard and risk recording. And now we're going to have a look at incidences and safety interactions. So this one here. So from here, I can record all of my incidences or safety interactions, and I can actually go back and look at all of my records. So obviously incidents, injury incidences are things that have actually happened. So somebody's got injured, somebody's got hurt, whereas a safety incident is something like a near miss, and we'll talk about those in a minute because they're really important. When we think about injury incidents, there's some information we need to know around the Act there as well. So some incidents are notifiable. So we can see that we've got a little yes/no section here for notifiable incidents. So if I just hover over that, a notifiable incident is one requiring hospitalization or emergency services. So if we have one of these notifiable events on farm, so if there is, heaven forbid, a death, if there is an injury or incident that we must notify, these are categorized as serious events, and they're going to trigger some requirements that you have to follow. So you have to preserve the site, and you have to notify WorkSafe. So by preserving the site, I mean you have to make sure that it's in a state that WorkSafe can come and do their investigation. And you must ensure that you keep records for these as well. And for notifiable incidences, you want to be keeping these records for at least 5 years. So as I say, we've got some smarts in here. So the system is actually going to prompt you if an event is notifiable or not. So we can see here that I've got an injury incident. And if I picked hospital visit, we can see straight away that pops over to a yes, and it's giving us a little note to say that we must report it to WorkSafe within 24 hours. If it was a no treatment injury incident, we wouldn't have to notify WorkSafe. So recording injury incident, it's very straightforward here. So I can go through who is involved. Is it just staff? Is it a contractor? Is it a visitor? And I can choose from my list of staff members that I've got in FarmIQ. We need to talk about if other people were involved. So a little bit of a summary here about what happened and how long that staff member was at work before the incident happened. So that's significant because if that staff member had been working an excessive amount of hours without having a break, obviously that's a big warning light for why an injury or an incident might have occurred. We have a bit of a description about the injury, what did that person sustain, and the location of that accident. We can link straight through here to our map as well. And then just some really easy click boxes here about what sort of injury it was. Obviously it was a concussion, it's going to be a head injury. And then in here we can record what our follow-up details were. So this is where we can think back to that process flow from WorkSafe. It's continuous improvement and it's continually reviewing what's happened. So what did we do immediately after that accident happened? Review the situation. Was the person trained to be doing that job? Should they have been doing it in the first place? And how serious could it have been? So this is where we're doing that review and we're taking some learnings from this. So could it have been a lot worse? What do we need to be doing to minimize this risk going forward? So we can link our incident to hazards that we've already identified. So I can select here from our existing hazards. So for example, my two-wheeler motorbike that I've recorded, I can put that in there. And that's going to link this incident into that hazard. So we've got traceability of everything that's happened, and we've got that information pulling together where we need it to. Was a vehicle involved? So as I mentioned before, vehicles accounting for about 80% of issues on farm. So it's important to hold that information in here too. So again, as we can create action plans around our hazards and our risk management, we can create an action plan out of this. So we can sort of conduct our own reviews on farm to figure out what happened. So it might be that we need to go and talk to another staff member that witnessed the incident and that can give us some more information. It might be that we need to follow up and we need to give our staff members some two-wheeler motorbike training. So from here, we can create our plan and customize it for whatever we need to do. So that is recording an incident. I'm just going to briefly talk now about near misses as well, because they're really important. So we're going to look at recording a safety incident. So a safety incident essentially is, well, it can be a near miss. So this is not a notifiable incident, but this is something that it can tell you a lot about the risks you're facing on farm. So near misses essentially predict the incidences that you're going to have. They're the things that almost happen. They're the almost accidents. So if you can have it as an almost accident, the likelihood is that one day it's actually going to be an accident. So if you're collecting this information, you can be much better prepared for the potential of something happening. So again, it's very similar format to recording an injury incident. I can record my staff member, I can create a plan, I can link it to a hazard and do that full review. So, you know, a perfect example of this would be that staff member riding that two-wheeler, going around a blind corner too quickly and nearly hitting a tractor coming the other way. So it's an almost accident. It's something that could have happened. So from that, you could prompt conversation about maybe driving slower on races, putting a speed limit on the race, putting a sign up, just to encourage that conversation about being safe when you're working. So it looks like we've just got a couple of questions here, which I will answer before we move on. Sorry, just bear with me. So, does the FarmIQ software allow you to see the risk level pre and post control? So yes, so certainly it traces all of the actions that you've done. So if you've carried out your risk assessment and you've identified that it's a high level of risk, then you've gone through and recorded all those actions, and then you could see that actually our risk level for this hazard has dropped. So the benefit of recording it all in here is you've actually got that traceability of the process you went through. So you can see what your starting point was, you can see what you've done to manage that risk, and then you can see your end point. What else have we got here? Would you say that the action plan represents the reasonably practicable steps you mentioned earlier? Yes, absolutely. I mean, certainly you need to be keeping that in mind when you are creating your plans, when you are figuring out how to manage your risk. So you want to keep that criteria in mind about, you know, is it feasible? Is it practical? Is the cost disproportionate to the risk? What's the level of harm? What's the likelihood? So you want to be considering all of that information when you are creating your action plans. Right, so we'll move on to the next section. We're getting through the time quite quickly. We're going to have a look at visits now. So we've got a visit register here, which is pulling together all of the records that I've recorded when I've had people on farm. So this is something I can record through my smartphone app. I can record when someone comes on, what they're there for, and I can record when they leave. So it's really important to have these records for traceability you know, who's on farm, when are they on farm. We want this to cater for our worst case scenarios. You know, if we have a fire, if we have an emergency, we need to be able to account for everyone that's on our property at the time. So we've got a list here of some visitors and some contractors. So we'll just have a look at adding in a visit here for a contractor, because they are slightly different than for a visitor. So when you have a contractor come on farm, you need to be having a conversation with them, because they have got they're going to have their own health and safety responsibilities as well as you. So as the farm owner, obviously you need to be responsible for everyone that is conducting work on your property, but your contractor is also going to have a plan around how they look after their own staff. So it's really important to have that initial conversation when they first come on. Normally a really good time to pair it when you have your discussion about induction documents. So we're going to look at recording a contractor on farm. So it's pre-populated for now. It's unlikely that I've got someone visiting me at this time, but we'll go with it. And then from my contractor list here, I can choose from people that I've had on farm before, or I can add one. So when I add a contractor to my records, I can actually indicate here, so have they seen my induction documents? And you can hold your induction documents in FarmIQ as well, so you've got everything in one central location. So I can choose someone from an existing business, for example, and just populate their details in there. So another really important part to this section is the induction page. So we've just got some yes/no questions here that are a good starting point for induction questions. So have you explained your farm procedures to this contractor? Do they have appropriate equipment for work? Do they have a subcontractor? You know, are they competent? Do they know all of the information around safety plans? Have they provided a safety plan, for example? So all of this information is something that you're going to want to be thinking about when you have a contractor come on farm. And are you happy with their health and safety practices? If you are not happy with their health and safety practices, then you know it's your farm and it's your responsibility. So you need to be having these conversations with your contractors on farm. So we'll just go back to our visit record here. So I'm just going to pick somebody existing so you can see the next step. So we put a reason and we put how many people are on farm. And that's then saved. So I'm just going to skip out of that. Oh, cancel. And then we can see that we've got somebody here who is status on farm. So we've recorded them as arrived, but they haven't left yet. So if you've got somebody coming on regularly to your farm, there is no reason why you can't give them access to FarmIQ. So this will give them access to the smartphone app. They'll be able to see your hazard map. They'll be able to log themselves on and off farm as a visitor, and they'll be able to record any incidences or safety observations through the phone app at the time. So lots of benefits there. So that's our visitor record, so I can go back and I can search in any time period to see who was on farm when. Really important for that traceability and having that information to hand when necessary. So we will just briefly go through emergency procedures and then we'll have a quick look at team meetings. So our emergency procedures section is really creating all those plans for the worst case scenario. So it's recording where our emergency equipment is, for example. So where are my first aid kits? Where's my chemical spill kit? And we've got a link here at the top, a guide to emergency procedures. So this actually links through to the government website, which has got some great resources around emergency planning. So lots of hints and tips there about what you would need to do and how to pull that plan together. So back into FarmIQ, we can record our emergency locations as well. So what's our meeting point if there is a fire, for example? What's our meeting point if we have an earthquake? And once we've determined these emergency procedures, we can actually run some of our own drills. So if you're having practice fire drills, or if you're having practices around what to do if there's a chemical spill, you can record all that in here. And again, it's just evidence to show that you're doing what you can to be compliant. You're involving staff, making sure they're aware of all of your processes and procedures. So if you do get audited, it's really easy to show that information. So here we can actually go in and create our procedures. So if we do have a chemical spill, what are the steps that I want my staff to take? What's the procedure that they can follow? And we can have all that set up in here. So staff can come in at any point and see that information. We can also export it as well. So probably wise if you're wanting to have a contingency for if there's a power cut and you've got no access to your computer. And we can also keep emergency contacts in here. So who do we contact if there's a gas leak? Who do we contact if the power lines come down, for example? And we can also maintain some staff records in here. So which of my staff are fire wardens? Which of my staff are first aid trained, for example? So in the interest of time, I'm going to leave emergency procedures at that and just talk very briefly now about team meetings. So team meetings are really important because it's a way of showing that you're making sure you're including all of your workers in your health and safety plan. It's making sure that everyone's on the same page and has awareness of what their requirements are. So I can record my meetings in here. It might be, a weekly health and safety meeting. It might be, 10-minute toolbox meeting at the beginning of every staff meeting for your planning sessions, for example. So I can put all my staff in here. I can record any visitors that I've got present, and then I can type here in my general notes everything that we talked about and the key points. So we've got again some yes/no questions just to prompt you about pertinent things to talk about in health and safety meeting. So did we talk about actions? Did we talk about safety issues? Do we have any contractor issues, for example? And then we move on. We can attach any files. So if we've looked at some emergency procedures, for example, we could attach them in here to show what we've talked about. And another really handy thing here is our hazards and incidents section. So if we identified a particular hazard last week, we can actually link to that hazard in here to say we talked about it. So it might be that we're talking about that new effluent pond. So we've discussed it, so everyone is across it and knows what this new hazard is. And I know everyone that now knows about it because I recorded them here at my team meeting. Same thing for incidents, so I can actually refer to a specific incident that happened. So it might have been this doctor's visit here, where a worker fell over in the milking shed. So we can talk about what happened and how we can possibly avoid that in future. So I can save my team meeting in here, and then again, I've got all my information in one place. Anyone can come in at any point and see our list of team meetings and refer to what was talked about and who was there. So that's all of our health and safety recording. So we've covered our 5 main features, somewhat briefly on the last 2, but we can answer some questions on that in a moment. And we'll just have a final look now at our last section. So we're just going to have a quick look at the dashboard here. So in our dashboard, this is a place where we can set up lots of custom reports. So it's our snapshot into sort of day-to-day life on the farm. So I've set up myself a little incident widget here. So I can see, I've just set it up to show me what's happening this year. I could set up one next to it for last year so that I can compare how we're going. But so far this year, we've had 1 safety observation, we've had 1 near miss, and we've had 1 doctor's visit. So just a really easy way to have a snapshot of how we're tracking so far. So it's that continuous improvement and monitoring of what we're doing. So that is the FarmIQ health and safety system in a nutshell. So we're going to have a look now at some questions. I see that we've had some come in here. So the question here is, in giving access to a visitor, what are you sharing? The whole system or just the pages you elect to share within health and safety? So it's the latter. So it's just the sections of the system that you elect to share. So if you wanted to give your contractor access to FarmIQ, for example, if you wanted them to have their own login, their own username and password, you could elect to just give them, say, the health and safety recording and the farm map, so that they'd be able to turn on those hazards, they'd be able to GPS locate themselves and see where they are in relation to those hazards. So yeah, it's entirely up to you, as much or as little as you share with that visitor or contractor that you give access to. So let's see what other questions we've got coming in here. So we've got a question here about risk levels. So where do I see the risk levels for each hazard in FarmIQ? So our risks that we've identified are going to be here in our hazard register. So if we just go back in and have a look at our hazard, so we'll go back and look into our tractor here. So the risks that we've really identified is you know, the potential harm, what is the risk of happening. So we can put in a lot more detail around here. At this stage, I've just got some basics. So you know, some risks could be around you know, if someone's doing really heavy hours in the tractor, they could have, you know, repetitive strain, for example, which has a potential harm of pain or discomfort for a person. So it's really in this section here that I'm going to be talking about my risks associated with each hazard. And we looked at that as well when we recorded our hazard or risk. Thanks for that question. So I'll just see what else we've got coming in. So we just had a question here about recording hazards and mapping hazards. So no, you certainly don't have to map every single hazard. So I can create from this screen here, I can create a hazard that just sits in my register that doesn't go onto a map, and I can equally draw, starting from the map, and draw a hazard there, and it will flow through to my hazard register. So it's one or the other. You know, it can be the register on its own, or it can be mapped and in the hazard register. So we've got another question here about, so do you need to have a paper trial with more detailed information, or is this digital information enough? So before FarmIQ went ahead and built all these tools, we actually spoke to WorkSafe and we said, what do we need to be building? What do we need to be providing in here that would enable a farm to be compliant? So what they recommended, we went ahead and built. So yes, if you are fully utilizing all of the health and safety tools in FarmIQ, making sure that you're populating all of that information, it should be sufficient for what WorkSafe requires. Thank you for that question. That was a good one. Great, we've got another question coming now. Can I print the map from in FarmIQ showing the relevant hazards and share with other people? Absolutely. So everything in FarmIQ is really easy to share, whether you want to do that digitally or whether you want to do that on hard copy on paper. So I've just gone back to my main map here. So I could give somebody access, I could give somebody a login, so they'd be able to come in and view this as we're seeing it now, or I could choose to print. So I can just select to print the whole thing. I might want to zoom in on certain features. I might want to select to print area and just draw a around my ponds, for example. I put my cables in there too, and then I can choose to print that. So once my print preview comes up, I can go ahead and print.
I'm sorry, but I actually can't hear Libby at this stage, and I suspect that you can't either. In fact, it would be useful if you could raise your hand if you can't hear Libby at the moment. Yep, you're raising your hand. Oops, that'll be Libby on my phone just now. Just hang around, everyone. All right, I've got an update here, which is that Libby Woods' laptop just died. So it's very unfortunate, but in fact, we were just about to draw to a close. We've just got one final question here, which was how would you cover off annual reviews of your safety performance, i.e. management reviews and development of plans for the coming year? And the word from Libby is to make sure that you've got that in as a task. And so that you can show the evidence that you've been doing that kind of review, and you've got all the records, obviously, that you can review. So I hope that answers your question. Anyway, thanks everyone for your participation this evening, and I'm just going to move back to my own screen. Because really there's only one more thing to do before we finish, which is to remind you that we have another webinar coming up in 2 weeks' time. So this was the end of number 3. We've got 3 more to go, and that will be on staff management. So organising and looking after people on a farm can be quite a juggling act when it's busy. And Libby will show you how the range of smart digital tools can help managers, staff and contractors. I'm just going to have a quick look here because another late question has come in. Thanks, Jackie and Libby, great job, thanks. Okay, and I think that's us for the evening. Thanks again and good night.